Hey everybody, this video tonight is called Where's Our King? And tonight we're continuing our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Samuel, looking at the 8th chapter where we're going to look at Israel demanding a king. And so 1 Samuel chapter 8 verses 1 through 3 says, Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So, from this section of the book of 1 Samuel through chapter 15, it concentrates on the interaction between the people of Israel, Samuel, and Saul. And through chapter 12, it describes the establishment of the kingship over the nation of Israel and the advent of Saul as their first king. And Samuel, at this point in time, was approximately 60 years old, and he appointed his two sons to serve as judges in Beersheba. And Beersheba, if you don't know, is about 57 miles south of Ramah. And Joel, you might think of the minor prophets book Joel, but Joel means the Lord is God. And Abijah means my father is the Lord. And so we see that he has two sons that had a perverted desire for the things of this world, for materialism, for riches. And it led his sons to continue into the act of bribery and to pervert justice. And they violated Deuteronomy 16 verse 19 of the law, which forbid judges to accept bribes. And we looked at that book back in March. And the sins of Samuel's sons became the pretext for Israel's demand for a king. And judges were not to be appointed by men or the office of judge. And it was to be passed on from father to son, kind of like what you see with the monarchy of the UK, where it stays within family. It wasn't something that people appointed. And verse 4 and 5 says, Then the elders of Israel gathered together to Samuel, and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us, like all the nations. And when Israel entered the land, they encountered Canaanite city-states that were led by kings. And we looked at that back in June in Joshua 12, verse 7 through 24. And additionally, during the period of time of the judges, Israel was enslaved by nations that were led by kings, as seen across the book of Judges. However, at the time of the judges, we know that there was no king in Israel. And as Israel lived in the land surrounded by nations that had kings, they wanted to fit in with the crowd. They had their own desire for a king to arise in Israel. And according to Deuteronomy 17, verse 14, God knew that this would be their desire, and God is going to give them the desires of their heart, even if it wasn't going to be a good thing. And so God would allow Israel to have a king. In verse 20, to skip ahead a little bit, says that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And so the end of the chapter is what backs me up, that Israel seek to be like the others around them. They seek to be like the world. And Gideon was offered the throne over Israel, as we saw back in July in the book of Judges chapter 8. And verse 6 through 8 goes on, But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which you have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. So Samuel was displeased when he saw the ungodly motive of the people of Israel behind the elders, where they're requesting for a king. And as a result, Samuel makes the godly decision to pray unto the Lord. And God tells Samuel to obey the requests of the people and to give them a king. And the nature of this rejection is contained in verses 19 and 20. And ultimately, seeking a king was a rejection of God as their king. They were really rejecting God, seeking for a human influence. And verse 9 says, Now therefore heed their voice, and however you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel will obey the Lord by describing the behavior of a human king in the upcoming verses ahead. And Israel would have no excuse saying, oh, we didn't know it was going to be like this, as Samuel was warning them here. In verse 10 through 18, let it rip, It says, So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before the chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your fine young men, and your donkeys, and put them to work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. So verses 10 through 18, just as Hannah asked for a son back in the very opening of the book in chapter 1, verse 20, Israel asked for a king. And the consequences, as we can see, Samuel lays out, what are the consequences of a human king? We see included drafting young men and women for his service. And the people would face taxation on their crops and flocks, unlike what they have seen before. And the king would have say over their animals and servants. And last but not least, the king would put limitations on their freedom. And, the limitations on their freedom isn't anything new, because we know from the Exodus and all that, under oppression and all that. And Samuel warns them that they would regret their decision for seeking this human king and would later cry out for freedom from his rule. And you'll see that in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4, unlike God's response to Israel during the period of the Judges in Judges 2:18, God would not be moved to pity, and therefore God will refuse to deliver the people out of the hand of their king who oppressed them. And God warns that most human kings are takers. They are not generous. They're looking out for their own kingdom. They are not looking out for the people. So, human kings they have a longing to be served. And I just saw a article about King Charles, who, you know, took over the monarchy of the UK. And he was, you know, telling one of the people that, you know, his servants, you know, like, hey, clean off this desk, take this out of the way, take that out of the way, stuff like that. You know, they want to be served. And verse 19 through 22 says, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. So in spite of Samuel's warnings, the people demanded a king. And up until this point, the Lord himself has fought the battles for Israel. God has given Israel continuous victory, as we talked about in the last video even. And Israel no longer wanted the Lord to be their warrior. They want to replace him with a human king as their desire. And the problem per se wasn't of having a king, but rather the reason of wanting a king to, you know, they wanted a king because they wanted to be like those around them, all around the pagan nations. In Israel, we see that they foolishly assume that there would be some greater power if they had a king leading them in battle. And soon we're going to see that God will give them their first king, Saul, who fails prior to God giving them to King David. And in Exodus 19 verse 6, God wanted Israel to be above all people. God wanted them to be set apart as a sanctified people, a holy nation, and they were not to be like anyone else. But here they wanted to be like everyone else. And sad to see, as God won a spectacular battle for Israel in the previous chapter. And Israel, they reject the rule of God, but could not escape it because God is sovereign. And to wrap up here, we looked at Samuel's appointing his sons as judges. We see that they are rejected as leaders over Israel. And we see that their reputation is that they lived perverted lifestyles. But in return, we see that Israel is requesting a human king. And we saw that Samuel prays about their requests, and God answered, as he will give them a bad carnal king. And their rejection of God as king reminds me of Jesus. When Jesus walked through his ministry and before the cross, Jesus was the rejected king as well. And I want to go over to John 15. John 19:15. And it says in John 19:15, but they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And so the Jewish mob declared before Pilate that Caesar was their king. They rejected Jesus as king. And God commanded Samuel to warn the nation, and Samuel warns them about the responsibilities of having a king. In what way was Jesus not a typical king, as we have described in verses 10 through 18? And I want to go over to the book of Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. So in my chapter today, we talk about the human king being self-absorbed, self-focused, where they want to, they want to be served. But Jesus, our king, it says this about him in Matthew 20 verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And, so we see that Jesus did not come to be served by us. Jesus came to serve. And we see that Israel demands a king despite God's warning. And man may ask God to step off his throne, but God will never step off his throne to please man. Some people might want to paint God as a puppet, that God has to do what I want. God has to listen to me. No, that's not how it works. That's a bunch of foolishness to have that kind of mindset. And when we resist God and we resist God's sovereign will, we only hurt ourselves. And I want to go over to one more passage in the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. It says here, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so Israel shows us how we get in trouble when we desire to be like the world and seeking the things of this world over our God, our King. And that's going to wrap up today's video. I hope it's been a blessing to you. And we are officially a quarter of the way through the book of 1 Samuel here. And we'll see you next as we're going to look at God leading Samuel, God leading Saul to Samuel. So have a great rest of your night. God bless, and we'll see you Friday night.